same things is kind of what I wanted to mention, which in the center, we have a lot in common. We care about permissionless collaboration. We're really open about collaboration, ethics and principles, and kind of how we want to give agency to the user or the end user, choice, Linux, same concept. And so I thought about this, and I thought, why is it that in this space, it's really interesting for a designer to be in here, and you have to kind of learn some new resources. And so these are kind of the driving forces. I'll start with new solo designers. So when I joined the space in like 2017, first there was not a lot of designers. So this was like 100% new solo designers. Now, like 2 years later, luckily, I did some research and kind of got around 160 designers in the space. There's actually more just in this research I did. And about 25% are kind of solo designers. And it's really interesting because in this space, like, it's not that designers are not wanting to come into this space. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the idea that there are these new solo designers means you're coming into a new space. You're usually the only designer in a company, unless you're like Coinbase or a larger project, and you're trying to learn everything at once. Pretty intimidating, right? So we thought about this, and I go, okay, so how can we actually then learn from each other as designers? And then how can we actually increase the interaction that we have between developers and key stakeholders and designers? And then sprinkle a little design value and say, how can we teach or spread design processes in a kind of a tricky, kind of quiet way? And at DEF CON in 2018 was the first year we had a design track, which was amazing, right? And being part of it, one of the ideas that people had was what if we had a UX audit? And so 2 years later, and we did 74 audits in a combination of 8 days, we learned a lot, and the best thing was designers loved it. I love this quote because it was while I received a one-on-one lesson on mixers, I could share my experience in setting up UX research. Win-win. There were designers who are really loving the interaction that they get to work on different projects. The UX audits were formatted in a way where you get one-on-one time, like an hour with a designer as a project, and the designer doesn't have to be a designer in your project at all, or even have to do anything with the project you're working on. In this case, she didn't even know what a mixer was. But then they could collaborate and talk about design processes, or work on a piece of that of whatever the product or DApp or whatever they want to work on, how to increase that. My best story here that I love from last year was MetaMask designers, the user researchers, and product designer worked with Gnosis, and they were both talking about onboarding to wallets. So you can kind of see how in this space we're working through similar things, but there wasn't really much of an opportunity before then to kind of talk about what we've been working on together. Turns out developers and founders loved it too. So they're really loving the fact that they can get this kind of free resource. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more. And if you want to participate this year, please ping me. We love to set it up in advance, and you just kind of show up, and you can see it was just a crazy, crazy room. And so really interesting, we're talking about these solo designers. We kind of created a place, which is these UX audits, where people could interact with each other. And then an interesting thing came up. There was this idea of the fluidity across collaborations. So this meaning considering the way we organize. And what I mean by that is we actually started to create these temporary collective working groups where projects would come up to me and say, I actually need UX help too. I want to look for a designer. I have this project. I have this need, etc. And so in the case of the Burner Wallet we wanted to redesign the experience of the app. And so I pulled together a couple designers that Carl and Alex had worked together, but they had come up with a new kind of design for the app and the wireframe and the UX and things like that. And then in a different context, Ethereum.org, Lily put together a bunch of artists and actually came up with these new designs that we're adding to this website. So you can see how you'll see people who have never worked together or never worked on a project together. And then designers are all of a sudden collaborating and like rearranging themselves to kind of come work together. And so my favorite thing is actually Web3. In Web3, open source is a default. So if you're working Web3, you probably must have open source. Otherwise, you're kind of like looked down upon, right? And so that kind of pushes design to actually have open design processes. Design, actually, I should mention, is already pretty open. We talk to users all the time. We encourage it. But I love this quote from Javier, who works on Aragon, that said, designers opening up about their work, sharing it in a way that others will have the freedom to inspect, remix, and learn will propel a new way of collaborative opportunities. So now we're talking about we rearranging to work together, but now what happens is we actually have open processes of tools like Figma. So Figma is, if you don't know, a web-based design tool that developers are loving. I learned that tool like in a hackathon in 5 minutes. It was so easy. It's super intuitive. And the difference between that and like Adobe is that it is just like a digital. Like it's free. Anyone could use it. Try it. It's fun. And funny story is, you'll see on this left here is Dylan. We had Dylan as one of our UX Awards judges for DEF CON. And he is also a big fan of crypto, but also he's the creator and the co-founder of Figma, so he understands what open source in design could look like and is driving the tool that's actually allowing us to do so. So the other option here is, this is the Grin, Mimblewimble Grin wallet, and so you can see that they're just like putting their work in the open. And anyone, it's kind of like you can fork, you can make a copy and like utilize it and have fun with it. So the possibility of sharing is really endless. This is really awesome. This would happen like 3 days ago. And so IDEO Collab Ventures, they actually did this interactive workshop on personal tokens. And this is like Figma in action. People are like throwing things in there and like drawing it. So it's like crazy. And you get to see what people are doing and you talk about it. And so you can see why it's so easy for us to collaborate together. And then I want to give a shout out to the deep work guys who are right there in the back right there, and have also been doing some open processes in the other room. They do an amazing job of this like live work in progress. So I mentioned that design could feel like a black box sometimes, like developers like, yeah, okay, we're going to get the designer to do that, and the designer feels like they have to do everything by themselves. Well, what happens is when you open, you actually live stream. This is a YouTube clip from their YouTube video where they live stream the research process, the user story process. They did like one live stream per one. They ran a design hackathon on staking UX. And so what happens is then you invite others to work that process with you, and it doesn't feel so scary. So the other aspect is Greenfield. The interesting aspect is, in this space, like a lot of people come to it because there's this whole idea that we could reinvent everything, we can redo anything, reimagine all these things. Like possibilities are endless, and that's awesome. But actually, designers actually work really well in constraint. And so, I don't know, maybe we're traumatized from like no one ever giving us any freedom, but we actually like when there's constraint. So when there is no constraint, what we see is actually a desire for shared knowledge and language, as well as this kind of standardization of UI and UX flows, but backed by user research. So this is why I really encourage anyone who hasn't seen any design processes to utilize them, because what's awesome is they've already been kind of like secured by research. Designers tend to do user research. We don't like to kind of like make things up because we're really worried that it's going to be a not great product. And so that's the standardization of user research coming from Greenfield is an example is like Christopher Ono, who's working on Monero. I think he was maybe the first person I saw that was really evangelizing this. This is his work on Figma, and he was sharing it, and he was saying, hey, I worked on all this stuff at Monero, like, go ahead and like tell me what you think, make some edits, like work on it. And he started creating this like icon library. And so this is like the understanding that anyone who wants to build on Monero, or anyone who wants to build on like what kind of icons we have some shared knowledge so that you're not starting over and over and over again. a good example of this is design systems. If you don't know what a design system is, it is basically a library that has both design and code, and so that it is a framework. So the example here, which you can't see because it's actually larger than this, there's so much work here. The Rimble team from Consensus, they did an awesome job where these are transaction state alerts. So what was happening is, you know, everybody would go onto a dApp and like, okay, I'm ready. And then you're like, did my transaction go through? What happened? Am I okay? It's like you go to a restaurant, you pay with a credit card, you don't just leave, right? The waiter goes, you're good. Or here's your receipt. Like you expect that there's like a okay and then you're leaving. And sometimes prior, we didn't have that at all. So sometimes you'd be like, did I get it? Like, where is it going? And so Rimble did a bunch of user research, and they started to standardize some of these UX flows, and saying like, this is an alert you could give. And that way, also dApps who are building on top of it, not only do you have some code and some design, but you actually now start to understand like thematically what you can do and what's happening in the space. 2018 was a really big year for design systems because Aragon also created one. It was called Lorikeet, but actually what they started to do was they decided that doing a kind of generic Web3 design system is pretty difficult. And so they decided to concentrate and like look at the amount of work they did. It's like insane, and anyone can go ahead, like scan that QR code, and you can go in and check it and like fork it, create your own. And so you're seeing that this sharing of understanding, knowledge of systems is like, it's happening. It's already happening. And then third, I mentioned the UX Awards. What we wanted to do with the UX Awards was actually create like a signal that, hey, this is kind of what the narrative of this year is looking like. This is what we kind of expect as good UX. And so we had all design panelists. We had designers who were like creating this. Oh, and then, and so we have like the winners, and it was awesome. Argent is one of the winners who were like amazing, and they came back this year as one of the judges. So the last part is powerful technology. So when we have really, really big technology, we tend to think about, like, especially now, the impact of that technology and the idea around like ethics and principles. Designers do this quite a bit, but not necessarily written form. And this is why I love this person Q, who wants to remain anonymous, but who created this like manifesto, design manifesto around like, she wanted to create a DAO, and said, this DAO, we always talk about a designer DAO, but this person who actually, it's gonna launch later with Meta Cartel, I think, and a couple people. But what they really care about is actually defining like why we want to work together and like what brings people here, right? Community starts because you have a shared value, and you go, hey, I'm interested in that value, or I'm interested in that mission. And so you join that community, and then all of you guys work towards this thing. It's the same as a co-op or things like that. And so a DAO is in some form like that. And so attracting people to work with you through ethics and kind of these principles is really useful. If you have not seen this talk, please go see Kate. He spoke at DevCon last year, and the idea around ethics and the responsibility that like how design could be weaponized. I know it's contentious, but flash loans, is it ethical or not? All these things, these kind of questions. Maybe when we start to think about it early on, we can actually start to think about how we can build it into product or into protocol, like really at a really early stage. And Ethereum.org kind of did the same thing. They created kind of these design principles to kind of expand how others can build upon the website already. And so we've got this amazing, amazing kind of group here. But wait, who's excited? Yeah? Yeah, there you go. OK. But there's a but. Design experience still needs help. So I talked about this research, right? Like 160 designers. Awesome. I tracked where they started and kind of where they ended up this year, and only 58% ended up staying in Web3. 14% kind of went back to Web2 and was like, no more. And then a couple people are dabbling, and then a couple of unknown, they're kind of silently disappeared. And I'm not talking about just like quiet people. They're people who legitimately used to be heads of designs and things like that are just like, what happened? And so we want to really improve designer experience. That's kind of why I'm here. And if you're a developer or a stakeholder, as a majority of you guys are, like encourage and introduce design interactions super early on, because then not only are you helping yourself, your product, but you're actually encouraging others to like have better standards of the quality of work you want to do. And please consider funding and resourcing open source design. If we could pool the open source work and open source design, we'll have better products as well. And if you're a designer, like continue to share. There are some amazing talks on that. Create your own ethics and principles. Start to like think about these like really interesting groups you can create. And so just high level design is kind of like, is shiny, but like if you dig deeper, there's really a lot of gold. So thank you for your talk, for listening to my talk. And open source design is something I'm super passionate about. If you have any questions, you're a designer, come talk to me. I'm also working on some stuff like validator experience and then like contributing onboarding. You can get my Twitter. So thanks. And there's some wine that we will have, not in this room, but we will have. So thanks. Sorry, I don't think we have time for questions.
Well, I mean, you are the last talk.
Oh, okay. Does anyone have questions? Statements? Sometimes they're stronger than questions. There we go.
I'm curious about that number where like 40% of designers that were in Web3 last year like disappeared. Is that like, do you have like a mailing list and you send emails to them?
I did that research old school. So I cross-referenced Twitter, LinkedIn, and then some of the work that we have also a Telegram group that we've been working on. So that's kind of where I've been doing it. I've been thinking about reaching out. Some people want to stay private, which is why I didn't like open source that. But that's, yeah.
But I mean, but the problem is that you have a sample. When you like to have an idea, you would also need to know how many new designers are in the space, right? To know if it's expand. Like the important question is, are we losing more people than we are acquiring people, right?
Yeah, exactly. That velocity. Yeah, exactly. And that's what I wanted to track. Originally, the idea was that I wanted to track. I thought my assumption was, oh, these people are still here, they're just working on different projects, and I want to track the links of projects and designers. But what I saw was, I was like, oh, where does this person work now? I was like, oh, not here. Where does this person? And I just went down that list. But I agree that sample size is really small, right? That's why I think with the 25% of like solo designers is like probably honestly higher, but my sample size is quite small. Right now, that's what I would love, is why I kind of like wanted to talk, was just to bring back everybody who was interested, like reach out to me or reach out, like tell someone so that we can have better data around that. Oh, sorry for my messy desktop.
Thanks for the talk. I'm working in an open source software, and I have a user interface, and it's very hard to catch what users need. And I learned that Figma exists, so I will use it. Great, but I'm afraid it will make them into like, you have this framework and like change stuff, but it might limit them in some ways. Do you have any advices not to limit them, like to express their needs?
Wait, sorry, can you rephrase that question?
My not problem, but goal now is to catch what my users need the most in my interface. Do you have advices?
So this classic example of build a UI and then see what users like about it. I think we can. Yeah, I didn't talk about a lot of the design processes because I wanted to just talk a little bit more historically about design in the space. But there are quite a few designers like boom right there who are really, really great at talking about those processes and have talked about this process in this chat. So that's a great question. Like we can kind of follow up with there, because there's a lot of ways, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay, thank you.
User research.